hits you as soon as you put your foot on the tarmac of this airfield, the intensity and the urgency of this moment. Every direction we look at Kabul International Airport, Afghans and foreigners in straight lines boarding the military transport planes that are all around this tarmac, taking Afghans not just away from their country, but away from the lives that they live, the identity they cherish, leaving everything behind to start from scratch.
The world was recently set on its heels after the swift and aggressive takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban, following the United States and NATO's withdrawal from the region. The collapse of the Afghan military and the utter failure of the Western allies to achieve their goal of establishing a peaceful democracy in the country has once again brought an infamous sobriquet to the foreground: that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. But what exactly does this mean? Well, the general idea is that any foreign power that comes into the region to conquer or exert influence in some way has a very difficult time, ultimately leading to failure, withdrawal, and even the eventual collapse of said foreign power. So, why does Afghanistan have such an infamous reputation? And will the United States become the latest addition to the graveyard? Firstly, we need to understand some history about the region that is now modern-day Afghanistan. The area has been part of various states and empires at some time or another throughout history. This includes the Persians, the Macedonians, the Mongols, and so forth. All of these powers were able to control the region successfully for centuries, and their eventual decline and collapse had very little, if anything, to do with owning Afghan land. So that is one strike against the legend. In the early 1800s, the British Empire was consolidating its hold on India. Afghanistan, which shared a border with both India and Russia, was a contentious point for the British. They feared that, should Afghanistan befriend Russia, Russia could use Afghanistan as a corridor to invade India and seize British-controlled assets. And so, as a preventative measure, the British Army invaded and attempted to usurp the Afghan Emir and install a pro-British, anti-Russian puppet government. The British believed the war would be a quick and easy victory, but the reality proved otherwise. The difficult, mountainous terrain proved an unsurmountable problem for the British Army. The war was costly and futile, so the British were finally forced to retreat. So, is this a strike in favour of the legend? Perhaps. But in 1878, Britain invaded Afghanistan again, and this time they were actually successful in establishing a puppet government acceptable to the British government. This remained the case for many decades, and the British Empire showed no signs of collapse in this time. It was only until the turn of the 20th century that things became hopeless for the British in Afghanistan, as rising nationalism led to the desire of the Afghan people to be recognised as an independent state. After a border conflict with British India, Britain was forced to withdraw entirely from Afghanistan and recognise Afghanistan as an independent state. Nonetheless, the British Empire continued to exist for many, many years following Britain's withdrawal from the region.
By all accounts, the Soviet takeover was meticulously planned and skillfully executed. But it has not been clear just how the Soviets were able to set up their coup without the Afghans realizing what they had in mind.
With Soviet support, communist insurrectionists overthrew the Afghan government in 1978. However, the new communist government and their radical reforms were deeply unpopular in the region, and rebellious uprisings began to spring up all across the country. In an attempt to stabilize the country and solidify the new communist government's rule, the Soviet Union invaded a year later. Although this intervention put a massive strain on Soviet-Western relations, it was relatively successful in stabilizing the country, at least at first. Just like the British, the Soviet soldiers struggled with the mountainous terrain, and preventing nationalist guerrilla fighters proved an impossible task. After a decade of war, the Soviet Union finally withdrew from a hopeless situation. Just 2 years following Russia's withdrawal, the Soviet Union collapsed. This is when the phrase, the graveyard of empires, became associated with Afghanistan. However, it should be noted that the USSR had been in decline for a long time at this point, and it is unlikely that Afghanistan was the deciding factor in the Union's ultimate demise. So, will the United States face a similar collapse now that they have withdrawn from the region? Only time will tell, but it is extremely unlikely, and as we have found out, the idea of Afghanistan being the graveyard of empires is just historically unfounded. Britain was successful in establishing a puppet government in the country for many decades, and the region has been under the control of one empire or another throughout history without consequence. Although what has happened in Afghanistan recently is shocking, it most certainly won't lead to the collapse of the United States. The reason for the Afghan government's collapse is complex, and it's likely mostly down to corruption. There was always the strong possibility the Afghan forces would fold without NATO support, but that is beyond the purview of this video. Regardless, one thing is for certain: the international image of the United States has been seriously wounded as a result of this seemingly inevitable withdrawal.
General Petraeus said in an article in the Washington Post a few days ago that the situation in Afghanistan, despite all of this money, has deteriorated markedly in the past 2 years. Those are his words. And he said Afghanistan has been known over the years as the, quote, graveyard of empires, and if we are not careful, it is going to help be the graveyard of our empire as well.